All right, welcome everyone. And to anyone watching this recording, I'm Carrie Brown. I'm filling in as the moderator today because our original moderator couldn't make it. I am currently a professor here at the Newmark Grad School of Journalism at CUNY, although I'll be heading over to Montclair State University in New Jersey starting this fall. I'm really excited to have these folks here. As you probably know, this is a panel about folks that took the really brave and critically important step of starting statewide independent investigative news organizations. We are certainly in a time of great stress and difficulty for journalism, and we just desperately need folks coming in and finding ways to fill that gap. So I think it's really exciting and inspiring to learn a little bit about, how did they actually make this work and, overcome some of the obstacles involved in doing that. So I thought we'd get started by kind of letting the panelists introduce themselves a little bit and just giving us a little bit about their backgrounds and kind of their origin stories. How did they decide to do this and how did they kind of make this happen in those early days? All right, Matt, you want to start us off?
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. My name is Matt Wynn, and I run the Nebraska Journalism Trust. Our origin story is probably familiar to I'm a journalist. I have been a journalist. I got the bug when I was 15 or whatever, and that was it. I was doomed. 2009, I think the very beginning of the nonprofit news revolution, a lot of my friends actually started these sorts of things. Half of them failed, half of them flopped out, half of them are still around. 10 years, and I was, at the time I was a 20-something. So I just thought, cool, keep it up, great work, love that for you. Then 2019, and Matthew actually took a buyout at the World Herald, I believe that timing's right, and I thought that was a sin, and it just kind of hit me that I'd been waiting for someone else to start this thing, and now it was gonna fall to me. So we did. Yeah.
We'll ask some more questions about that later because there's some good stories associated with it, but yeah. Rebecca.
So I had been a reporter and just looking around, it felt like everywhere was a huge dumpster fire, and I was just very concerned about the prospects for democracy, the prospects for my own career, the prospects for my community. And I got connected to Akash, who was the editor-in-chief of New York Focus, and he had just started it. And he had basically started it because he was freelancing on New York journalism, and he couldn't find any outlets anymore to place his pieces. He could only find national outlets that were willing to place his pieces. And so kind of took a huge leap of faith. And as a publisher of New York Focus now, I do development, operations, strategy, not what I had been doing in my previous career as a reporter, but I think a lot of those skills are transferable, and now 3 years later, we're still here and we're growing, so that's how it started.
I'm Chris Baxter. I'm the CEO and president of Spotlight PA in Pennsylvania. We got started in 2019, so we'll be 5 in September. And the kind of original origin of Spotlight PA was the severe decline of coverage of Harrisburg, the state capital in Pennsylvania. And to give you some idea, when we launched Spotlight PA, we effectively doubled the full-time press corps in one day, which is not a statement as to how big our startup staff was. It is a statement for how small the press corps was. And in fact, I had worked at the Star-Ledger in New Jersey previously, and just the Star-Ledger's State House Bureau, which had been through plenty of cuts and changes over time, was about the size of the entire press corps in Harrisburg. But kind of worse than that was the fact that on any given day, 5 of the 6 reporters that were remaining were probably covering the same story. And that wasn't because they're not good reporters, or necessarily even that that's what they wanted to do, but it was because that's what the business model was dictating that they had to do. And so when we started Spotlight, we really wanted to just disrupt the kind of narrative of media in Pennsylvania, which was very segmented, very regionalized, very geographic. we wanted to create something that was geographically agnostic, that was statewide, that leaned into our state identity, that bridged division rather than kind of perpetuating it. So we started, we had about 6-7 folks and about $2 million in initial runway from some community foundations, et cetera. So this was basically an idea on 2 pieces of paper and some money. And then they hired me in March 2019 and just sort of handed it to me. And so today, almost 5 years later, we're 26 people and $3.5 million a year. We've expanded with 1 local bureau. We're close to a 2nd local bureau, so we continue to expand. We provide our work to 120 licensed newsroom partners across the state. That includes pretty much every newspaper, public radio station, community blogs, digital outlets, community weeklies, niche publications, student publications, community television, soon, hopefully, not to leave this room, some network television. And yeah, it's, we're providing a vital service. The reality is, and we actually looked at this just a few weeks ago, we realized that because of the decline in coverage from the Associated Press, which does very little now at all in Pennsylvania, if we were to disappear tomorrow, Spotlight PA was to just go up in smoke, about 90% of the outlets in Pennsylvania would have zero access to state capital or statewide reporting. So, I think we would agree that there's 2 sides of the coin we work in, and that is, one side is it's very exciting to be able to build something new, and that's why I took this opportunity, because I didn't think I'd ever get another chance to build a newsroom how I thought it should be and needed to be. But the flip side of the coin is the problem and the erosion of what is out there is so rapid that you constantly just feel like we're only scratching the surface. We can't even keep up with the decline, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard work, but rewarding work.
Awesome. And this can be kind of, conversational. We're all friends, so if anyone has questions or just wants to talk about any particular piece of this, feel free to jump in. Yeah, I think one thing would be interesting to talk a little bit about that we discussed at lunch was just, a lot of journalists, they see the need out there and they want to do this, but, they're journalists and they have journalism skills. But then there's this whole other layer of business and funding and sustainability that goes into this. How did you kind of think about that, or what have you learned about that in the process of, building these organizations and making them, be able to exist? Any of you?
Yikes.
One of the most important things to understand is that the choices you make about the business model for journalism directly impact the journalism you get, right? So it's not a mistake that we get the journalism we get today kind of writ large. We get it because when newspapers had to transition to digital, they transitioned to a business model that they understood, which was ads and digital ads. And digital ads require eyeballs, right, and quantity. It's a quantity play, quantity, eyeballs, impressions. This is where clickbait came from, right? This is where page views, this is where it all came from, because there was a choice that was the business model that it was going to be, that they weren't going to charge for the content, because frankly, newspapers had never monetized the content. They were always monetizing the newspaper for ads. So that's not what they knew. They knew ads. And so, everything that has stemmed from those decisions, right? A reduction in quality, suddenly investigative and accountability, and things that just take more time and resource don't pencil out in this new model, so you don't get it. And that plays out over time. And now, we see that even that model is failing, but it's just not a mistake. It's not a sort of we just got here and there's all these external forces at play. And no, this is the result of very real choices. And so I think what we're doing is also making a very real choice of aligning the business model with something that puts the quality and impact of the journalism first. So I do think it's important, whether you're coming from a business side or a journalism side, the 2 things are inextricably linked. And for people who are still kind of very much no, the journalists are the journalists and the business is the business, and they don't talk, like that's very outdated and not gonna work in the new world order. But also those things are not necessarily, like they don't have to be at odds, right? It's just because that's what we've come up with and that's what there has been, but it doesn't have to be that way.
That's a really good point.
I'm gonna steal that. That was well put.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The click thing that all of us worked in was broken, and it is because of business decision. And I think as nonprofits, we get to put the mission first. We have a mission statement. We have a thing that we do that we tell the IRS about, and that is why we exist. We don't exist to make some guy rich, which is good because no one's getting rich. But we are here to do revelatory work that changes lives, that sort of thing. That's what we're here to do, and that's what the business is aligned to. It has been to your question, learning this stuff on the fly is wild. We are a nonprofit. We raise money, the nonprofit. We ask people for money. The first time that I realized Dick Tofel was a genius was when someone asked him about the business model, and he said, well, we ask people for money, and then we spend it on journalism. Like, yeah, that's it. That's all there is to it. But there's an art and a science to that. There is an art for certain gifts from certain peoples, from certain institutions, that sort of thing. And there's a science of membership, of saying, what % of our subscribers, of our readers find us valuable enough that they will contribute to us on a monthly or an annual basis. That becomes very reliable. That's a baseline you can grow. That's different than going and asking people for money. And figuring out what that looks like at the end of the year on a spreadsheet is something that I'll never be comfortable with.
And I think there's something to treating this whole endeavor as a reporting project. When I first started in my role, I spent the first few months interviewing any newsroom nonprofit leader that I could find and kind of making a guidebook based on the lessons that they had learned. And people were, A, incredibly generous with their time, but B, it was incredibly instructive. And I feel like by the end, I didn't know how to do this, but I really understood some of the things that people were facing and what challenges people had faced and how they'd overcome it. And it's not a science, and the only way to do it is to do it. But there's a lot of similarities between outlets, and it can be very instructive to talk to people.
And it seems like all of you kind of had to cultivate some relationships and some trust with some of the folks that do really care about statewide news and could see, that this was something where there was some big gaps. I mean, just in order to get kind of that initial support. I mean, I think that's what's hard. People want to start something like this, but they're like, what do I do? Just go to the Knight Foundation? Because that's what everybody does? Or like, how do I even begin to approach, getting some seed funding to like start this off? So yeah, I don't know. Anything you wanted to add about that?
I mean, my old boss in New Jersey used to always tell me, like, talk is great, collaboration is great, all this stuff is great, put points on the board. And I think that's really what we try to do is, we're going to talk and market and brand and all that, but at the end of the day, if we're not putting points on the board, nothing else matters. And points on the board is good journalism, right? And I think that's where like people should, and like students, young people should take a lot of heart. That there's actually this whole industry and sector of journalism now that's doing well and that is prioritizing quality and investment and like the real kind of work that people want to do, not, the 5 stories a day of, whatever. And I think that's of real value to the folks who want to do it. And also it just kind of puts the value proposition front and center. And so I think like when you're starting out, to your point, like someone who wants to start, I think you at first just have to kind of put up, right? And then you need to have that kind of honest conversation of like, if you find this valuable, you meaning reader or, whoever you're talking to, then, for all of these reasons, you need to support this so it can continue. And that kind of re-education campaign is like basically what we're involved with on a day in and day out, because I think I told Matt yesterday or someone yesterday, it was just like, it just so happens that the fourth pillar of our democracy, which is journalism, a free press, the only profession specifically named in the Constitution, was part and supported by a very lucrative and successful commercial business. Now that broke. The journalism didn't break, right? Journalism's role in democracy didn't break. It's never broken. In fact, there's a pretty strong argument that it's more appreciated and like more front and center today than it has been in recent times. But there's a reason now that the public has to step forward and support this kind of journalism when they didn't have to before, right? And that's really the hard part. Like, people have always been used to supporting the orchestra, museums, the arts, cultural institutions, because it always has been, right? It hasn't always been that way for journalism. And so that's the uphill battle that I think we face in trying to like get these, really moving.
It's interesting. I mean, that parallel is made in our dorky world all the time. Opera, ballet, whatever. These are all supported by philanthropy, and journalism should be no different. The difference is people love the ballet. Like, people love these things. They're supporting that thing. And that sounds like a joke, but it's not. They love the ballet. No one is like, you know what I love? Journalism. Just us. It's the stories. It's the people. It's the place. They don't love journalism. They love Nebraska. And they love Nebraskans, and that is kind of the gap that we need to cross with our supporters is, look, you don't have to support journalism because it's awesome. It's not. Journalism kind of sucks a lot. But when we tell stories of people doing amazing things, when we hold truth to power, when we change laws because something's not working, the system is broken, that matters. That matters, and that's what you're supporting.
And to speak to that hurdle of starting something, if you think about what we do as reporters, what journalists do, it's incredibly transferable. Being a reporter is about figuring out who to talk to. When I started, I was like, all right, we want to get funding from XYZ source. This feels like a black box. Who the hell do I have to reach out to? But as a reporter, that's the entire job. How do I get from point A to B to C? How do I leverage whatever sourcing, and in this case, network I have, in order to get in front of the right people and convince them to talk to me? And then once I convince them to talk to me, as a reporter, your entire job is to get them to give you information. In this case, it's just money. But you have to, it's still a pitch that you're making when you're a reporter. You're presenting a case for them to, it is an exchange.
I love that. And didn't you all start, you were saying, putting points up on the board like Chris says with just a WordPress blog at the very beginning? I love that as an aspect of this. You just kind of got to get going, start it somewhere. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, maybe, do you guys want to brag a little bit? I mean, we've talked a lot about impact, and I know you've had some impact, but just to kind of share, what kinds of big wins that you've had, and how do you kind of measure that impact or share that impact, because that's also a piece of sustainability and donors and things like that.
Yeah. We have, in fact, today, I have an email that I haven't looked at yet. We have a new quarterly report. Every month we track something like 50 numbers, and I keep adding to it, much to the chagrin of anyone on my staff. We keep coming up with new numbers that we want to track, and one of them is systems impact. And anytime that a law is changed, a bill is introduced, somebody resigns, a policy is changed at a school district, something, like, we write it down and we point to it, and we can say this is the number of times that we have had a systems impact on an institution. Yeah, and so cases of that, the Lincoln Public Schools stopped charging for student lunch debt. That was a thing they did directly. They held a meeting right after we did a story, and they changed that, no questions asked, right? Like, this is stupid, you're right, done. We did a story about a state commission, the crime commission. The idea is, in Nebraska, if you go outside and you get bopped on the head, you should not be held responsible for the medical costs associated with the head bopping. Every state has a program like this. It is a thing that's everywhere. And in Nebraska, it really sucked. It was not doing anything. It was giving away this much money, and in every state around us, they were giving away this much money. We were supporting 90 people or something like that a year, and in Iowa it was like thousands. They're better at this. So we did a story, just kind of, objectively, calmly detailing, here is how this particular program sucks, is failing us, is not doing its job. 2 weeks later, that guy resigns, right? That's impact. That's what we're doing here.
So we have those, instances of impact, and then when we talk about big change, what our ultimate goal is, we haven't reached it yet, but hopefully someday, is changing the culture of Albany. We cover what happens in the state capitol and what it means for communities all over the state. And right now, there is a sense in Albany that no one is watching. And so if we can prove, if we are dogged enough, if we're consistent enough, if we're around long enough, people will know that someone is watching, and we think that that will have impact for years to come, and it will change the entire state. We're figuring out how to measure that. We're figuring out what that looks like, but that is the ultimate goal. That is the pie in the sky. Not only will that change the way our elected officials behave, but I think that will also change what we as citizens expect of our elected officials. So that's the ultimate goal. When we first started, one of our big stories that right out the gate was this big campaign finance law had just been passed. Everyone was super excited. It was seen as kind of a premier bill on this in the nation. We circled back a year later, and it was never been enforced. So after doing an investigation on that, now it is being enforced, which is great. And then things like the New York Department of Corrections had, under the radar, banned incarcerated people from publishing any of their writing or artwork, something that, there had been nonprofits, there had been services provide for them to enable them to do so. And there was this blanket ban that under the radar went into effect. We wrote about it in 24 hours. They rescinded the policy 24 hours later. Just last week, we published 2 stories about a secret committee of legislators in Albany that at the very end of the session looked at hundreds of bills and decided whether or not they were going to come to the floor at the last minute. After writing about this, what we heard is that many of these people's colleagues, many senators, did not know that this group existed. So it was mysterious to them even how certain bills were being brought to the floor and what got put through. And once we revealed its existence, we still couldn't get people to tell us who was in this committee. We got a tip about when the meeting was happening, and so our reporter showed up early in the morning and just could watch who was going in and out of the room. And when he asked people about it, there was a lot of expletive-filled responses. We called the budget our Super Bowl, so we all drive up there once a year to cover the budget. And speaking to what Chris was saying about the size of the press corps this year, we had 5 people up there, and we had more people up there than any other outlet in the state. So it just speaks to how hollowed out some of this coverage has become. And we don't feel like we've scratched the surface of what needs to be covered, but it feels like at least some things there that previously didn't exist.
Yeah, to your point about kind of the sense that no one's watching and how our presence, it's about immediate impact, like these examples, but it's also about kind of like bending that arc of accountability over time, which is much harder to see, but very, very real. I had a reader ask me a few months ago at a speaking event. He was like, do you ever wonder, for all the things they're willing to do when you're there, what it means that they're willing to do when you're not there? And it's like, I had never thought of it in that context, but I thought it was a really great way to think about it, all the things that we figure out when we are paying attention. For Spotlight, it's very similar to what you said. We hope to kind of, again, bend that arc of accountability over time. Harrisburg, I think, in a lot of ways, like Albany, is sort of geographically isolated from the population centers, and it's sort of out of sight, out of mind, and they just kind of want to do their own thing.
That's the point, too.
And it's the point. Yeah. And even preserving, I talked earlier about like our regional cultural identities, like a lot of the preservation of power in Harrisburg is predicated on preserving these divides. So to make it, to keep the Philadelphia v. everyone else, to keep the rural v. urban, to keep, like, they all sort of play off these divides. And I think with our coverage and our republication, we're really trying to kind of break those walls down. Early on, I always like to start with this example because I think it gets to the business side. But early on during COVID, we were, of course, covering the state labor department, and everyone's labor department was underwater with unemployment claims. But because our reporter had actually paid attention to a department that had gotten no attention for years, some of the people inside started coming saying, hey, I know this is like the big thing right now, but there's a much bigger story that no one knows anything about. And so it turns out when people get paid too much unemployment assistance, they have to pay it back. And while sometimes it's fraud, most often it's actually like bureaucratic and paperwork errors for why that happens. And they have to pay it back with interest, and that interest rate is prescribed in state law. But it had turned out that the Labor Department for 10 years had charged a far higher interest rate than was allowed by law. They had discovered this, and for following 6 years did nothing. They talked about it internally. They never told the public. They never told anyone affected. Different commissioners had come and go. For all intents and purposes, it was done. And so we found out about it, and we dug into it, sourced in the department, got records, et cetera. And in our final go to the department right before we published, they issued a press release and admitted to the error and said that they owed $19 million to Pennsylvanians. And so at this point, all in from like day one to this story, Spotlight PA had been about $1.7 million. So it's just like, that's the kind of return on investment that you can get with journalism. And we talk about this with people who are politically active, right? And ask like, why do you give politically? Like, what motivates you to do that? And a lot of times it's like, because I want to affect change on this issue, I care about this issue, et cetera. And it's just really important to know that a lot of times journalism can move the needle so much faster than our political system ever will. And so I think that's really important. A few others, we had uncovered that the Pennsylvania State Police, which is the 4th largest statewide law enforcement agency in the country, had quietly stopped tracking the race of drivers it pulls over 4 years ago. If you don't have that data, there's absolutely no way to detect racial bias if it exists. Pretty much everyone else does it. They had stopped and told no one till we figured out 4 years ago. Then they immediately resumed and started a partnership with the University of Cincinnati to analyze reports and make those public. A more recent example, we dug into the rent and mortgage relief program that the state was running that came out of the pandemic. So it was all these federal dollars that went to the states to run any number of things. But our state had outsourced it, and it was a complete disaster. People weren't getting answers, applications were getting lost, money wasn't going out, et cetera. And the great part about this story is it has, I think, the two kinds of impact that are important. So it had systemic impact in that the day after, or like 2 days after we published, the state fired the third-party contractor and took over the program. But during the reporting, before we had even published a word, our reporter, Charlotte, had gotten at least 4 or 5 applications that were stuck or lost, found, and through the system, just by doing her work. And when she did a follow-up 6 months later, showing that the state takeover had also been a disaster, the same thing happened. She got help for 4 or 5 people that had been stuck in the system. And so it's both the human impact of these systems, but also the systems themselves.
One thing that I'm sure often when we're talking to donors and stuff, you guys are in the same boat as me. They want to ask about bias, political bias. Are you crazy liberal? This sort of thing. And what all these stories illustrate to me, all we want is if we have a system, if we have something, it should work. That is the bias of journalism. If we have a system, it should work. And so when the system isn't working, that's a story, that's an expose, that's what we do here. And that is the fact that people can't get their claims in time, is that a Republican strategy? Is that a Democratic strategy? No, it's just a bureaucratic failure. And that's beautiful.
That's a really good point. Yeah, we talked a little bit at lunch too about doing listening tours, and sort of community engagement is kind of close to my heart, and just kind of how you listen to your audiences, but also help, just raise awareness that you even exist and that you're doing this kind of work. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about what you've done on that front and what the effect has been?
Sure. So when we were first getting started, before we started, I called Carrie because she is a community engagement person, and we built our listening tour strategy out of your advice. So we do this a couple different ways, but the canonical version, the best version, is you go to a town and you partner with whoever is there, a community foundation, a newspaper, like you find some group that you can work with. You do an invite-only thing. They tell you, these 10 people have great stories to tell. They invite them in. We hear them. And those can be, Matthew and I have been to these things, like these can be 8-hour ordeals. They can be rough. 15 minutes, no bathroom breaks, right? Every 15 minutes, a new person comes in and tells you their entire life story, and then the next person comes, and this just goes. This just goes all day long. But you walk out of there with amazing stories. You always walk out of there. It might not be the story that they think they're pitching, but there is a story. Each one of these people is interesting and has a story to tell. So we do that. We also always try to work out a public thing where you're accessible to the public. And those can be wild because you get people with, I mean, you know, you've got your gadfly types that that just want to talk about whatever. So you've got that. But again, almost to a T, we always walk out with an incredible, there's one guy, he came to a listening tour, he walked in, he looked like central casting Nebraska farm guy. Overalls, seed corn cap, 9,000 years old. And he told us a story about a missile silo on his property and something involving a Jeep and soldiers and helicopters and guns. And I was like, what? And Natalia did that story. And it was one of our most well-read stories ever. No discernible impact that it could make, just a great story about a guy and missile silos. Wind turbine, yeah, it was, I mean, sure. It was more interest than I'm giving. It was a good story. All right, fine. Wind turbines, he's 9,000 years old, as I said. He had a ranch. He wanted to put wind turbines on his ranch so he could make money. That was his plan. He tried to do that, and it turned out this missile silo, they had changed the rules around the barriers, the boundaries around missile silos. He could not construct it because it was too close now to a missile silo. And so, sorry, you're out of luck. You don't get money. That's crazy. Sorry, listening tours. So public portion, private portion, and then usually we try to do like a fundraiser as well, and where we meet our supporters and that sort of thing. And they're great, just as you thought.
Well, we modeled our strategy after what you guys do because we picked your brain for advice. So far we've held a number of public-facing events where we've had partnered with the local community foundation or a local newspaper or the local NPR affiliate and various nonprofit organizations and tried to get as many people to come as possible. We plied them with pizza and we compensated everyone who comes to every event with $15 gift card. And then we also had them fill out a survey when they were there, and we also sent out such survey to all of our subscribers and put it on various Facebook groups and tried to get as many people to talk about what they feel is missing in their community. And they were also compensated with a gift card, which felt important for us to give people something for their time. And right now we're sifting through all of this massive amount of information that we received, and we're trying to use it to figure out what our strategy should be. What are the beats that need more attention? What are the places that need more attention? How are people receiving their news? How can we tailor our distribution strategy to make sure that we're reaching them in the way that they want to be reached?
Yeah, we also did listening sessions when we launched around the state. And we've continued to do that with our local bureaus that we've launched. We've done kind of intensive studies in those areas, which have been very focused on kind of qualitative feedback and as many people as possible, informing what we should do. Because ultimately, right, like the very simple equation to nonprofit news is like, we produce something that you think is valuable and you step forward and support it. And so we need to make sure that we understand what people are going to view as valuable. So from that side, on the journalism side, but also just organizationally, like we do so kind of what I said at the beginning, like how we were trying to disrupt the old model, we're also trying to disrupt all of the negative experiences that people have had with the media now over the past 20 years. And that can actually be very little things. Like I have this rule where we answer pretty much every email unless it comes in just flaming hot and completely inappropriate, in which they just get an auto unsubscribe. But everyone else, we engage, right? We answer emails. People have come to expect that they won't get a response. If they come in saying, why did you do this story? It just proves you're so, conservative or liberal or whatever. We'll respond. and point out some other stories, point out some other coverage, and you'd be shocked how many times that person then responds in a much more positive way. But people also just really appreciate that, like, they know us. Like, we respond, we're real people, we're here, we're on the ground, we live here, we care about this place, we have families here. We want Pennsylvania to be better. And we also genuinely think that there's like more that connects us than divides us. We just don't necessarily get that message all the time. And so we just really try to show up, like show that human side, be very honest and open about what we're doing. And it just seems like the more we do that and the more we get in front of people, that in-person time is irreplaceable. When we show up and talk about what we're doing, it always moves the needle, always. It could be a group of 5 people or it could be a group of 125 people. It doesn't matter. And I also think like no one else is playing that. That's the grassroots game, right? Sometimes we think about like what do politicians do in campaigning that's effective that we can learn from, right? And one thing they do is they show up in person. And it's not to say like you can take everything from politics because it's all so effective and whatever, but there is a reason, right, that they do what they do. They've done this for a very long time. There's a reason. And so, yeah, that kind of just showing up, being there, really, makes a difference. So we try to, do some of those things too.
Is there any tension between kind of the local and statewide aspects of this in terms of like what resonates with readers or sort of how you calculate how you're going to spend your resources in things like this? I don't know. Does that make sense?
I mean, we are a slow news operation. We only do 4 stories a week. Like, I think one week we had 5 stories, and we were pretty impressed with ourselves. So it's slow. And what that means is we don't cover a lot of things. And so one of the things that we try to do is anytime we do tell a story that is local or whatever, or just about a person, I mean, some of them, calling them local even seems like it's too reductive. I talk about a universal idea. Like there has to be universality to it. There has to be some human touch point. There has to be something that makes that a story worth telling. This is not a story about this particular town. It's a story about the human condition or something big like that. We try to make it a good story. And that plays out in all of our numbers, right? When I was at USA Today, our time spent was like 15 seconds. That's how much time people spent with a story. Last month we had 6 minutes. I mean, it's just insane. The quality of the work, the level of stories that we can tell, and I think it does go to that universality. People respond to that. They engage with it, literally.
No, totally agree. We feel like the only way that we're going to be successful is if we are narrowly tailored to our specific mission. So who are we? We ask the central question, who runs New York? And we want all of our stories to flow from that central question. Who runs New York, and how can we make it a more democratic and transparent state? And if it speaks to that mission, then we feel like it could speak to everyone who lives here.
I love that. It's cool. Yeah, I mean, to what Matt said, like one of the hardest, if not the hardest, part of the job is all the things that we kind of say no to. Because I think instinctually as journalists, but also again, the business model of legacy media, we have come to equate value with quantity. And that I think is fundamentally, it is not necessarily true, for one. For two, I think it's evolving because people's digital lives and experience, their email inboxes, whatever, everything now is just a fire hose. So we publish, about 1 story a day plus other stuff, but like on average 1 story a day. And I was really worried at the start because it's like there's just always this tension between quality and quantity. And I was like, this is not going to be a quantity play. We can make the business model work on quality. And what we heard from people was like, no, actually, like I don't want 10 things a day. I want you to give me the most important thing today. And we hear that from people all the time. They say, you know, like if they still get their local paper, they're like, I will skim the entire paper, but if I see that they've picked up a spotlight story that day, I will read it from top to bottom. And so that's what we tell people is like, we're not gonna give you everything, but you know that when we give you something, it's gonna be worth your time top to bottom. And it's gonna like move the needle for you, right? It's gonna make you think, it's gonna make you act, it's gonna be just of more value. And you know, what we're seeing early in Spotlight's life is that indeed people place a value on that and will come forward and support that. And I think, again, to the re-education effort that's needed here, constantly trying to divorce quantity from the value, right, is just so important. And so hard to do because so many metrics that are still in our lives, you know, whether we want them to be or not, like page views and, you know, even if you're only looking at them to the extent, you know, for good reasons, to the extent they're converting to a subscriber or a member or whatever, they're still there and they're still out of our control. And so there is always a tension, but, you know, I think we just have to make quality a functional business model. It has to work. Otherwise, we're headed in a not so great direction.
Do you,
I'm just thinking about, and Carrie knows this too with students, is how do we get, is it the quality thing that will get young people to start reading and not just scrolling or looking at TikTok or looking at other kinds of things? Because, I mean, my students, and they're journalism students, they don't want to pay for it, number one, and I can barely get them to read it. Now, if they read something good, I assign something and they read it and they really like it. And they're like, oh, well, I read it, it was like this. But how do we break through that barrier? Do you have any ideas about that? Or is it
no,
quality?
I don't have any ideas on that.
I mean, are you finding that with, I mean, likely your donors are probably many are older people. Are you finding a younger audience?
Yeah, I mean,
Any issues that you work on, or?
it's I am not a younger audience, so it's weird. It feels like God, what was the class that I failed in college where you're studying old things? It feels like anthropology. Yeah, right. I never went. It was a terrible class, in my defense. But like, you know, we have this idea that we should be platform agnostic with our work, that our work should, yes, we do written word because that's what we know, but it should, the same story, you know, any good story is really just a sentence. And that sentence works on TikTok or whatever. And our stories, we should be platform agnostic. Our stories should be everywhere. They should be air, they should be water. And we have people who do that. They make sure that our stuff is on platforms that I don't know the names of either. Does it work? I don't know. We have people who follow us on these platforms and they see our stuff and they're at least aware that there is a story that has this headline associated with it, right? Is it the same? Is it as good? Those are the questions that keep me up at night. I don't know. Right. Well, our highest demographic is women 25 to 35. That's bananas. I don't even know any women 25 to 35. How is this happening? Yeah.
I think some of this is, I think this question gets more attention now because of social media and the changing like consumption habits of young people. But I always say a couple things. Number one, young people that we're talking about today are not the same young people as 5 years ago, as 5 years before that, and all of their habits are changing. So we, as part of this local bureau effort that we were part of doing a study locally, the project lead talked to some high school kids, and she said none of the high school kids were on social media because they're like, it's just a mess. I don't know what I can trust. Like, why would I be on it? And we were like, you know.
Where do they gather? What do they do?
I don't know.
It's anthropology.
But my point is that like someone's life cycle and their life cycle with news, this like issue actually has been fairly consistent over time, which is that as people get older or they have family, they have kids, they have families, they start to interact with the school system, they start to see like what it actually means to pay real taxes, they buy a home, right? They have to deal with like a zoning board or all of these life experiences. They tend to then become more invested in news and information because it is relevant to their life. And that has actually been true for a long time. And I think some of today is just that same thing, right? And so what I say is like, yes, we are worried about that. Yes, we can and should do more to try to reach a younger audience for sure. But equally as important, we are trying to make sure that when that young audience becomes or comes to the day where they need us or want us, that we exist, right? That is like equally as good of a thing I can do for that 20-year-old today as like making sure they see our story on TikTok. Because there's gonna come a day where they're gonna need what we do. And so I just think it's a little more nuanced than like we often engage in with that conversation.
Something we're trying to do is make more servicey pieces part of the equation to reach people. So we can do this long few thousand word piece on why people's electric bills are going to be higher. And it's a really arcane process, and it's kind of inaccessible even to the most high information reader. But then pairing that with a piece of, here's how you can try and fight back when your power bill gets higher, or things like that, where people who they're Googling and they need a piece of information that we can repackage our work to enhance their lives.
Yeah. And so to the question, right, I think all, I'll speak for myself and you can agree or disagree, but like, we understand that for what we do, right? And I think we're increasingly understanding how we can be of utility. Like utility is becoming a huge piece of what we are. But maybe we need to think more about like, okay, well, what is that utility for a 25-year-old at that point in their life? And then how can we provide that? Because that simple exchange of like, this person needs something and we can deliver it is super valuable, right? And is like exponentially valuable for like loyalty and brand loyalty. So we just need to kind of do a better job understanding like, well, what service or thing could we provide that would be that value? Yeah, well, a couple things. One is kind of to what Matt said earlier, which is as much as possible, do not frame things in a partisan context, because as soon as you do, people just magnetize to their pole and you've lost them. So instead, we try to frame around what we consider to be largely, or you could think of like the majority, right? I often in Pennsylvania, when I do things, talk about the considered majority, which just means that like there still is a majority in this country that will like generally look at issues or like can be moved on an issue to make a vote, right? It's not perfect, it's really, really messy, but like they're not kind of completely lost, right? And we saw that in the midterms, right, around abortion, in particular, where the electorate moved around an issue and the majority spoke pretty loudly. And also, like, if that considered majority didn't exist anymore, we would be gone. Like, we would be Russia. Like, this would already be lost. So, number one is a lot of people we talk to think that considered majority doesn't exist. And that's really dangerous, because if you don't think that that exists, then you have no incentive whatsoever to engage or involve yourself, right? So A, we talk about that. B, we talk about, again, issues that we believe are generally universal, which is like, if we the taxpayers pay for the government, then we have a right to know how they spend our money, right? That's not Democratic, that's not Republican. Actually, like a lot of these values we talk about, you could argue are kind of very like Reagan-esque. And so if we decide collectively there's gonna be a government program, we have a right to know that there's outcome-based measures and that it's working and that it's fair, right? And even some of the, right down to the language, right? We can talk about equity in a government program, or we can talk about fairness, right? And everyone generally agrees that like that thing should be fair to everyone. Like I should have a fair shot, you should have a fair shot. If we, elect an official, we have a reasonable expectation that they'll be ethical or, God willing, legal in what they do, right? And so if we focus our energies around and our reporting around these topics, then it naturally cuts across the partisan distinctions. And so we've seen in our annual reader surveys, we actually have a very high number of people that identify as somewhat or very conservative compared to most other media, and especially legacy media. And I think that's in part because of how we approach the reporting, and also people can kind of see over time that, well, we really don't care like what your party is. We just care, whether you're being truth and honest and transparent and, these general things. So if we align ourselves with those values and we talk about those values, then I think that goes a long way. And I think there's still too many news organizations, there's some in nonprofit even, I think, but most of legacy, that would even be afraid to say those like 4 things I just said, right? And I just don't understand, like, if we'll stand up and say a free press is vital to democracy, then I don't think it's controversial to say like, well, we want more people to vote. Like, that's not, that's not Republican or Democrat. That's not really subjective. Like, the more people who vote, the better. I don't care who you vote for. Like, I just want you to make an informed vote and understand the ramifications of that vote. But wherever you land on what that is, like, so be it. And we talk a lot about that. And I think that gives us identity. Like, people understand where we're coming from. We don't have like a shadow agenda, or we just don't say anything so they don't really know, right? And that's where, again, legacy media has done so much damage to itself, in part self-inflicted, in part not, but they are so afraid, they are so fragile that any loss of any constituency of readership is painful, and they don't want to piss anyone off, so they just don't ever say anything, right? And they've sort of abdicated their role in a community. But then they become empty, they become hollow, and then there's no identity to them. And if you have no identity, you feel no loyalty to them, right? And you can just see how it plays out in a community.
I agree. We're getting kind of close to wrapping up here, but does anyone have any kind of last things you want to get across, or last questions for each other or for the panel or anything?
So
Choose wisely.
the Nebraska Journalism Trust has multiple titles. We have Flatwater Free Press, which is and will remain our flagship. Investigations, everything should be in service of investigations, of holding truth, power, of all that sort of stuff. Silicon Prairie News is a totally different animal. It's about tech, it's about business, it is about high growth investment. The whole strategy there it's totally different. It had 3,000 subscribers when we got it, and something like 2 were people that were already in our world. Perfect. We just launched an Omaha newsletter, so we have reporters who do Omaha stuff. We're working on getting a Lincoln reporter. That's something we plan to achieve by the end of the year. I think we will achieve by the end of the year. I'm working with publishers around the state, small publishers, independent publishers, to get them funding to do what they need to do. And all of that can fit in the Nebraska Journalism Trust mission. It's all about journalism and storytelling that is Nebraska. So how big is big enough? I don't know. Huge, massive, ridiculous. We've got 2 million people. We should probably have 2 million people on staff. I don't know.
Just like the news organization down the street, same number.
I think we can keep growing strategically in ways that satisfy the needs that are there. Flatwater, I feel like, is at a point where do we add more beats, right? I mean, when we started, we hired Yenchi and Natalia, and they didn't have beats. They just did whatever. And now Natalia has a beat, Yenchi doesn't. But Yenchi has a specialty that kind of, makes clear what she has to go into. We have a State House reporter. We started adding beats, and that, I think, is a thing. Can we keep doing those? Can we add a university beat, for example? Is that something? I don't know. I think that could be interesting, but that would be a wild deviation from what we've done already. But if there was a way, there is another nonprofit organization, I forget their name off the top of my head here, but they do higher ed coverage. They put higher ed reporters across the country in Shops Lake.
Open campus.
Yeah. Could we cost share a reporter with Open Campus and then justify that? That'd be great. Could we stick a reporter in? We're doing Documenters, which is going to be, it's starting in Omaha, and then it's going to McCook. And that can be, depending on how that goes, we could replicate that in 200 towns across Nebraska and bring some real civic engagement, city hall kind of reporting, not accountability reporting. But then that becomes the chum that leads to investigations, right? As long as we center Flatwater, we can do anything. How's that for a non-answer?
Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And yeah,
Thanks so
thank you
much.
for being here.
That was fun. Movie theater.
No, I'm gonna steal so much of what you guys.
Yeah, it's fun to talk.
Here's my question for you guys. What has been your recruiting practices? How did you get such good reporters?
We got really lucky with those two.
Living in New York, I really get their story about. I obviously understand Nebraska, and Pennsylvania seems comparable to that. And unlike New York, like the New York Times still has reporters in Albany,
Yeah.
right? So how do you guys differentiate yourselves? How do you compete with that?
So they have two reporters in Albany.
Have two?
Yeah. And so actually they've been scaling back their greater New York coverage now. They really see themselves as an international newspaper. So they're based in New York, but they're not a New York newspaper, and that's not the center of what they do. And then if you look at other newspapers, the Wall Street Journal used to have a greater New York section. They've now cut it. If you look at New York City hometown newspapers, which had bureaus in the capital.
Newsday have people up there?
Newsday doesn't have people up there. If they do, it's maybe half-time one person. They used to have a whole flourishing bureau up there. Then you have the New York Post, which obviously is great, but it's a tabloid, so it's different from what we do. The New York Daily News has been totally gutted. The Albany Times-Union, which is the paper in Albany, is half the size of what it was around 2 decades ago. And then you have all these local newspapers around the state. We talk about this one paper because they won a Pulitzer in 2006 in Glen Falls. And at the time they won the Pulitzer, they had 18 people, and now they have 4 people. So there's all these newspapers around the state that used to have people in Albany full-time covering what happened, and now they just don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. When I was listening to it, that was the one.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very good. Great.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, so, recruiting.
Yeah, so actually,
You might have asked that.
it's been on my mind a lot.
Yeah.
When I was in school, the newspapers, the TV stations would come and
Yeah.
recruit at the school.
Yeah.
And I was like, we should do that. So I called my alma mater,
Yeah.
and I was like, hey, what day is that? I'd like to show up. And they're like, what are you talking about?
They don't do that.
What the
Wait,
hell?
where are you?
Missouri.
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Wait.
Is there career fairs here in Columbia?
Is that gonna?
So I called the Missouri School of Journalism and asked them to do this very obvious, easy thing. And they're like, no, we've never even heard of that.
Well, it
Please
feels
go
like
away."
such an abdication of.
Okay, so then we called like
We do that.
Yeah.
I mean, the school
But
does that.
I called INN about this. And I was like, the reason ostensibly that they don't do it is because the newspaper chains, the too big, they didn't have the budget for it anymore.
Yeah.
Allegedly. I don't know what your experience here has been. But so I reached out to INN and I was like, guys, let's do that. Let's be the newspaper.
Right.
Like, you guys should work these out. Let everyone
Yeah.
come. I'll go with the Kansas City weekend. We'll go to Missouri. We'll go to Kansas.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, people don't necessarily travel super far, and we have the advantage of just being
In In New York,
so
yeah.
much media
We do
here,
it
so they just
virtually
come.
too. We go to
Yeah.
like the virtual career fair.
Right, we've done that, especially in COVID. They were all virtual, obviously. That is weird that they don't
Yeah.
do anything.
But
And that they
we're
acted like that was
forcing
a
it.
weird
Yeah, he had
question.
never heard.
You're like, what are you
the
talking
guy
about?
I was talking to was just like I had a third eye.
Huh.
He was shocked.
Those poor students, yeah.
But then, I told INN, I think you should do this.
Yeah.
The 5,
Our
10 year
product,
struggle for us,
yeah.
right? And they were on it anyway. I'm gonna do. We're gonna do it. We're gonna do this tour of like 3 or 4 colleges. And
Yeah.
we're gonna partner with the Beacon. I think we're gonna grab somebody from Iowa. We're just gonna do it.
Because they all have journalism schools. Does
Right.
University of Nebraska not have like a good? I don't know much about
I
it.
have a
but-
really good relationship with the University of
Yeah.
Nebraska.
Oh, okay.
I go there every
Nice.
week and teach a class.
Oh, cool.
Sort of.
Yeah.
And so that works. We hire fellows that way. Like
Yeah.
there's a state program that we call for intern.
Yeah.
So interns are basically free. So I'm all about that.
Yeah.
And we make them year long. We bring them on, and they're amazing. We just skim the top 2 or 3 kids off every year and put them in that. One woman, she's a timekeeper in Virginia. She was our first. The one we've got now, I don't know, she might be president by the time she graduates. She's
Wow.
incredible.
It's awesome.
Well, the challenge has been getting people to go to Albany. So a bunch of us are here, a few of us are in Albany, and we want more people in Albany and around the state. And that has been a challenge for obvious reasons, but also because some of us are here. It's hard for us to be like, well, we can be here. You got to go to
So are
Albany.
you moving to Albany?
No, I'm not moving to Albany. But I don't have to move to Albany because I don't cover Albany. I need
Yeah, I can see why this is hard.
yeah. I need to be where the money is in New York City.
That's true, but yeah.
What's your recruiting?
Like we've shifted, we ran into the same things. Like,
Yeah.
So we had a critical mass around the Capitol, but actually like our most prolific Capitol reporter just moved to Philly. You know, the Amtrak's like
Yeah.
an hour, but it's really simple. It runs every hour. It's like it's not really a big deal.
Yeah.
It's not like no one cares. Like it's just to the extent he can do his job.
Yeah.
And he can. So.
We're trying to rent an apartment in Albany, and just and say you can come in and out. You guys have somewhere to stay. You can live in New York, but then you can go spend a week up there if you want, or 2 weeks up there, and we can have a home base. If not an office, an apartment.
Yeah.
Really good idea.
That's a catch-22. Ironically, even though it's like less expensive to like live in our students often like the less advantaged or the less privileged kids, like they have
Yeah.
they're taking care of grandma. You know,
Yeah.
like
Right.
they can't move like
Yeah.
they're not like I can't pick up like I have real serious responsibilities here where
Yeah.
some privileged kid actually could just be like, sure, yeah, I'll just get dad to buy me.
Yeah.
So it's like you always run into that where it's like you're a logical fit for this actually, but for you to move,
Yeah.
it's not really super realistic.
Yeah.
So it's so hard.
I do find, however, like, I still feel skepticism from kids about the model. Like, I still feel like
Really?
they think we're just, fizzle.
Well, I think the model's developing way faster than they're being educated on the model.
Yeah.
We,
Right?
yeah.
I think there's a whole there could be a whole course about like the business of nonprofit news.
Yeah.
It's developed so much, right? And it's like a good field, but there's not. And same with just how much the field has grown. And I spoke to students at Penn State like back in April or something. They had no clue, like how big it was, how much how often it pays better,
Yeah.
right? And the kind of work they can do.
Yeah. These kids that don't know about us, they take a job at Daily, they burn out, they go to PR, and like, shit, we never even had a chance. They're gone. Like, we're losing this class of potentially great reporters to the business bullshit, and we have nothing to do with it.
The biggest concern to me was when we did that event, I hung out with the editor of the Penn State paper, and I said, like, what's been your biggest challenge, like the hardest thing to overcome? And I did not expect him to say this out loud. But he was like, we can't get almost anyone to think about anything but themselves.
Huh.
He's like, no one has any concept of like the paper, give it, like, remember, he's a like student of his time, right? And he was like, we can't barely get anyone, the reporters, to think about anything but themselves. And
What
like,
does he mean in terms of their careers or their specific
it's just
based
like
on the campus
them,
community?
their career, their brand, their everything. No sense of like the paper, the institution, the mission. It's just like so it's just like, if that's not good for me, then I'm not going to do that. Like,
That's a, I think that's an interesting point. I know at least probably from marketing side, like we have gotten so, it's a long trend. The Kiwanis clubs are very organic. We don't go to church. We don't separate into society, and we're going so individually. And the pace at which that's happening
Yeah.
is exacerbated. And that's, that's why I would argue that's why media is dying. That's all like, when you don't give a shit about society, there is a collective as much as we're.
Just they didn't have social skills. I mean, it's easier for people in their 40s to like disappear for a while, but for them, they were like in high school.
Yeah.
Or, you know what I mean? Like they come out and they're like, I don't know what's going on in the world. I only know what's going on in my bedroom, and that is all about me. You know, I mean, it's a weird. The vibes the past 3 years or so. Really weird.
My son graduated high school in 2021.